Doctor. Sarah Mitchell's coffee cup crashed to the hospital floor, the sound echoing through the empty hallway as she stared at the emergency call display. The photographs on her phone screen showed something that defied everything she knew about wildlife medicine. It wasn't just another injured animal case. This was a 10-month-old black bear cub with a tumor so massive it had consumed half her face, leaving one eye sealed shut and her jaw grotesquely distorted. The ranger's voice crackled through the speaker. "Doc, she's got maybe 48 hours left and she's looking right at me like she knows she's dying." Sarah's hands trembled as she scrolled through the images, each one more heartbreaking than the last. The night shift nurse gasped behind her, then whispered a prayer in Spanish. In the reflection of her phone screen, Sarah saw her own haunted expression, the same look she'd worn 3 years ago when they told her about Tommy. "Get the surgical team ready," she commanded, her voice steady despite the storm raging inside her chest. How could she explain to anyone that this dying bear cub had the same trusting brown eyes as her son? Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. The Montana wilderness had always been Dr. Sarah Mitchell's sanctuary, but 3 years ago it became her prison of memories. Every pine tree reminded her of Tommy's last camping trip. Every mountain trail echoed with his laughter that would never return. At 45, Sarah carried the weight of a mother's worst nightmare, losing a child in a senseless car accident on his 8th birthday. The drunk driver walked away without a scratch, while her boy died instantly at the intersection just 2 miles from their home. Now, as head veterinarian at the Glacier Wildlife Rehabilitation Center, Sarah threw herself into saving animals with the desperate intensity of someone trying to outrun grief. Her colleagues whispered that she worked too hard, stayed too late, cared too much. They didn't understand that each rescued creature was a small victory against the randomness of death that had stolen her son. The call about the bear cub came from Ranger Michael Thompson, a weathered 52-year-old who reminded Sarah painfully of her late father. The same steady voice, the same gentle way with wounded things. Michael had been patrolling the northern sectors of Glacier National Park when he discovered the cub near Avalanche Creek, barely alive and abandoned by her mother. In the wild, bears instinctively reject offspring they sense cannot survive. "She's a fighter, Doc," Michael's voice had cracked over the radio. "But that tumor, I've never seen anything like it. Looks like it's been growing for months." The center's director, James Crawford, was a different breed entirely. At 58, he ruled the facility with bureaucratic precision and an iron grip on the budget. Crawford had built his career on making tough decisions, often reminding staff that sentiment doesn't save species, science and fiscal responsibility do. What most people didn't know was that 15 years earlier, Crawford's 12-year-old son, David, had been killed by a grizzly bear during a family camping trip in Yellowstone. The tragedy had transformed him from a nature-loving father into a man who viewed every bear as a potential killer. The bear cub they would soon name Hope represented everything Crawford had learned to fear and Sarah desperately needed to save. Hope was a 10-month-old American black bear, smaller than she should have been due to malnutrition and the massive tumor that had grotesquely deformed the left side of her face. The growth pressed against her skull, threatening vital brain functions while making it nearly impossible for her to eat or see properly. Glacier National Park in late summer buzzed with tourists, but Hope had been found in the remote backcountry where few visitors ventured. The nearest road was a 2-hour hike through difficult terrain, making any rescue operation a logistical nightmare. The center itself sat on the park's edge, a modest facility funded by a combination of federal grants, private donations, and Crawford's relentless pursuit of efficiency over compassion. As Sarah prepared for the emergency transport, she couldn't shake the feeling that this case would test more than her surgical skills. It would challenge everything she believed about second chances and the price of playing God with nature. The emergency call came at dawn, cutting through the Montana wilderness like a blade. Michael Thompson's voice carried an urgency that made Sarah's blood run cold as she raced her pickup truck along the winding mountain roads toward the recovery site. The ranger had found Hope near Avalanche Creek, hypothermic and barely breathing, her massive tumor having finally overwhelmed her small body's ability to survive. When Sarah first laid eyes on the bear cub, her medical training battled against maternal instinct. Hope lay motionless on a makeshift stretcher, her breathing shallow and labored. The tumor had grown so large it appeared to be consuming her entire left side, transforming what should have been an adorable bear cub into something that looked more like a medical nightmare. Yet beneath the grotesque deformity, Sarah could see the same trusting brown eyes that had haunted her dreams since Tommy's death. "Jesus Christ," whispered Dr. Patricia Williams, the surgical specialist Sarah had called for backup. "How is she even alive?" Michael knelt beside the stretcher, his weathered hands gentle as he adjusted the warming blankets. "Found her mother's tracks heading north about a mile back. She abandoned this little one 3, maybe 4 days ago. Bears know when their cubs can't make it." The transport back to the center took 45 minutes through treacherous mountain terrain. Sarah monitored Hope's vital signs while fighting back memories of another emergency room, another fight against time, another child whose life hung in the balance. Hope's heart rate was dangerously low, her body temperature barely registering on the thermometer. Every bump in the road could be her last. They burst through the center's doors just as James Crawford emerged from his office, clipboard in hand, and his face already set in disapproving lines. Sarah had seen that expression before, the look of a man who had made up his mind before hearing the facts. "Dr. Mitchell, what exactly do you think you're doing?" Crawford's voice carried the weight of 15 years of accumulated bitterness. "This animal is clearly beyond help. The humane thing is to give her a chance," Sarah shot back, not breaking stride as her team wheeled Hope toward the examination room. "She's young, she's strong underneath all this, and with surgical intervention—" "Surgical intervention?" Crawford's laugh was harsh. "Do you have any idea what that would cost? We're talking about extensive facial reconstruction, possible brain surgery, months of recovery care. This facility operates on a shoestring budget, not fairy tale dreams." Sarah stopped dead in her tracks, turning to face her director with a fury that surprised even herself. "Over my dead body will you euthanize this cub without giving her a fighting chance? Dr. Mitchell, you're letting your emotions cloud your judgment. This is exactly the kind of sentimental decision-making that— Don't you dare lecture me about emotions!" Sarah's voice echoed through the corridor, drawing stares from the entire staff. "This bear deserves the same chance we'd give any patient. If it's about money, I'll find the money. If it's about expertise, I'll bring in specialists. But I will not stand by and watch another innocent die when I have the power to save her." The silence that followed was deafening. Lisa Thompson, Michael's wife and the center's head nurse, stepped forward with the preliminary examination results. "Vital signs are stabilizing. The tumor appears to be benign but aggressive. Surgery is definitely possible, though the risks are significant." Crawford's face had gone pale, his hands trembling slightly as he gripped his clipboard. "The cost estimates, nurse? Conservative estimate, $85,000 for the initial surgery alone. That doesn't include recovery care, rehabilitation, or potential complications." "$85,000? Crawford's voice cracked. "Our entire discretionary budget for the year is $12,000. Even if I wanted to authorize this procedure, which I don't, it's financially impossible." Sarah felt the familiar weight of helplessness settling on her shoulders. The same crushing sensation she'd experienced when the doctors told her there was nothing more they could do for Tommy. But this time, she refused to accept defeat. Then we'll find another way, she said quietly, her voice steady with determination. GoFundMe, private donations, corporate sponsorships, whatever it takes. Crawford shook his head slowly. Dr. Mitchell, I'm ordering you to euthanize this animal. That's final. No, it's not. Sarah's words hung in the air like a challenge. I'm requesting a 24-hour emergency stay to explore funding options. According to hospital protocol, emergency cases require administrative review before euthanasia orders can be implemented. Crawford's eyes narrowed. You're quoting policy to me? Fine. 24 hours. But when you can't raise the money, and you won't, this animal will be humanely put down. That's not negotiable. As Crawford stormed out, Sarah looked down at Hope's peaceful face and whispered, I won't let you down, sweetheart. I promise. She had no idea that promise would soon ignite a national controversy that would test everything she believed about love, loss, and the lengths we go to save what matters most. The transformation began with a single photograph. Lisa Thompson had snapped a picture of Hope sleeping peacefully in the recovery room, her small paw resting against Sarah's hand through the cage bars. When Michael posted it on the center's Facebook page with the caption, "This little fighter needs our help," neither of them expected what happened next. Within 6 hours, the post had been shared 3,000 times. By midnight, it had reached 50,000 shares, and the comment section overflowed with offers of help, prayers, and increasingly generous donations. Sarah watched in amazement as her hastily created GoFundMe campaign climbed from $0 to $5,000, then $10,000, then $20,000. Doc, you need to see this, Michael called out, his voice filled with wonder. He held up his phone, showing a text from his daughter in Seattle. Jenny says the story's on the local news there. They're calling it The Bear That Stole America's Heart. Sarah's own phone buzzed constantly with notifications. CNN had picked up the story. Good Morning America wanted an interview. The #SaveHope hashtag was trending on Twitter alongside messages from celebrities, politicians, and ordinary people who saw something in Hope's story that resonated with their own struggles. But as the media attention grew, so did Crawford's desperation to shut down what he called this circus. The breaking point came when Tommy Chen, an investigative journalist from the Washington Post, arrived at the center asking pointed questions about the facility's budget allocation and Crawford's personal history with bears. Mr. Crawford, our research shows that you've consistently underfunded wildlife rehabilitation programs while maintaining a fully staffed hunting guide certification program, Chen pressed during an impromptu interview. Some might say you have a bias against preserving bear populations. Crawford's face flushed red. I have a responsibility to taxpayers to make fiscally sound decisions. This isn't about bias. It's about reality. But isn't it true that your son David was killed by a bear 15 years ago at Yellowstone National Park? The question hit like a physical blow. Crawford staggered backward, his composed facade cracking for just a moment before he regained control. That has nothing to do with this situation. I will not have this facility turned into some kind of expensive publicity stunt for Dr. Mitchell's emotional issues. The interview, posted online that evening, revealed more than Crawford intended. Eagle-eyed viewers noticed the framed photograph on his desk, a young boy with Crawford's eyes, wearing a scout uniform and holding a stuffed bear. The contrast between the loving father in the photo and the cold administrator denying Hope her chance at life struck a powerful chord with viewers. By the second day, the GoFundMe had reached an impossible milestone, $200,000. Donations poured in from retired schoolteachers sending $5 bills, tech entrepreneurs contributing thousands, and elementary school classes holding bake sales. Mrs. Eleanor Watson, a 78-year-old widow from Billings, had organized her entire retirement community to pool their Social Security checks, raising $8,000 in a single afternoon. "Honey," Mrs. Watson told Sarah over the phone, her voice trembling with emotion, "I lost my grandson Tommy to leukemia last year. Couldn't save him no matter how much money we threw at treatments. But maybe we can save this little one. Maybe that's how healing works. We save what we can." The mention of another Tommy sent chills down Sarah's spine. She found herself believing that perhaps this was meant to be, that hope represented a chance for redemption she never thought possible. Crawford, however, saw the mounting pressure as a personal attack. That afternoon, he filed an emergency injunction with the federal court, arguing that the surgery violated animal welfare guidelines and represented an unnecessary expenditure of federal resources. His legal filing painted Sarah as an emotionally unstable veterinarian projecting her grief onto an animal that should be humanely euthanized. "This is not about saving a bear," Crawford declared at a hastily called press conference. "This is about a grieving mother who has lost all perspective on proper veterinary care. Dr. Mitchell is proposing an experimental procedure with a low success rate on an animal that would be better served by humane euthanasia." The statement backfired spectacularly. Within hours, #Crawford Heartless was trending alongside #Save Hope. Video clips of his cold demeanor went viral, contrasted with footage of Sarah gently stroking Hope's fur while explaining the planned surgical procedure. But Crawford's most devastating blow came when he revealed Sarah's personal history to the media. "Dr. Mitchell lost her 8-year-old son in a car accident 3 years ago," he told reporters. "While we all sympathize with her loss, she is clearly projecting her maternal instincts onto this bear in an unhealthy way that compromises her professional judgment." The revelation sent shockwaves through Sarah's support network. Some supporters questioned whether Crawford was right. Was this really about hope, or was Sarah trying to save the child she couldn't save before? The doubt crept into comment sections and news discussions, giving Crawford's legal team ammunition for their argument that Sarah was emotionally compromised. That evening, as Sarah sat beside Hope's cage watching the bear cub sleep, she felt the weight of public scrutiny bearing down on her. Hope's breathing had stabilized, but the tumor continued to grow. They were running out of time, and now the entire country was watching to see whether love could triumph over bureaucracy, whether one woman's grief could transform into healing for another living creature. Outside, protesters had gathered, some supporting Hope's surgery, others carrying signs reading, "Let nature take its course," and "Stop wasting taxpayer money." The battle lines were drawn, and Sarah realized that saving Hope would require more than surgical skill. It would demand proving that sometimes the most rational thing we can do is follow our hearts, even when the whole world is watching and waiting for us to fail. The court hearing was scheduled for the next morning, and Sarah knew that whatever happened in that courtroom would determine not just Hope's fate, but whether she could finally find peace with her own devastating loss. The courthouse steps buzzed with an energy that reminded Sarah of a political rally rather than a legal hearing. News vans lined the street, their satellite dishes reaching toward the overcast Montana sky like mechanical flowers seeking light. Protesters crowded the sidewalks, some holding handmade signs reading, "Give Hope a Chance" and "All Lives Matter," while others countered with "Stop Government Waste" and "Nature Knows Best." Sarah pushed through the crowd, flanked by her hastily assembled legal team, led by Rebecca Martinez, a wildlife rights attorney who had driven 12 hours from Denver to take the case pro bono. Behind them walked Michael Thompson, still wearing his ranger uniform, and Dr. Patricia Williams, who clutched a folder containing Hope's latest medical reports. "Dr. Mitchell! Dr. Mitchell!" Reporters shouted questions from every direction. "Is this really about the bear or your deceased son?" How do you respond to critics who say you're emotionally compromised? What's your reaction to the death threats? Sarah kept her eyes forward, but the last question made her stumble slightly. The death threats had started the previous evening. Anonymous messages on social media calling her everything from a taxpayer thief to worse things she tried not to think about. The polarization around Hope's case had reached a fever pitch that shocked even seasoned journalists. Inside the federal courthouse, Judge Margaret Thornfield presided with the stern demeanor of someone who had seen every possible human drama play out in her courtroom. At 62, she was known for her no-nonsense approach and her particular expertise in environmental law. Crawford's legal team, led by government attorney David Kim, had arrived early and sat with the confidence of people who believed the law was clearly on their side. Your Honor, Kim began his opening argument, this case represents a dangerous precedent where emotional appeals override scientific judgment and fiscal responsibility. The defendant, Dr. Sarah Mitchell, is asking this court to authorize an expensive experimental procedure on an animal that veterinary science clearly indicates should be humanely euthanized. Kim's presentation was methodical and devastating. He presented budget analyses showing how the surgery costs could fund wildlife preservation efforts that would benefit hundreds of animals. He cited veterinary studies questioning the ethics of subjecting wild animals to extensive surgical procedures. Most damaging of all, he brought in Dr. Robert Harrison, a veterinary ethics expert from Colorado State University, who testified that Hope's quality of life would be permanently compromised even if the surgery succeeded. The tumor has caused significant neurological damage, Dr. Harrison explained, adjusting his wire-rimmed glasses. Even with successful removal, this bear would likely suffer from seizures, vision problems, and behavioral abnormalities that would make survival in the wild impossible. We would essentially be condemning her to a lifetime of captivity for our own emotional satisfaction. Crawford himself took the stand with a composure that surprised Sarah. Gone was the angry administrator from their previous confrontations, replaced by a man who spoke with quiet authority about the difficult decisions wildlife managers faced daily. I've been in this field for 23 years, Crawford testified, his voice steady. I've seen countless well-meaning people make decisions based on emotion rather than science, and the animals always suffer for it. Dr. Mitchell's proposal, while well-intentioned, represents exactly the kind of anthropomorphic thinking that does more harm than good to wildlife populations. When Kim pressed about Crawford's personal history, the director's mask slipped for just a moment. Yes, I lost my son to a bear attack, but that tragedy taught me the importance of respecting wildlife rather than trying to turn wild animals into objects of human sentiment. My son loved bears. He would have understood that sometimes the kindest thing we can do is let nature take its course. The afternoon belonged to Sarah's team, and Rebecca Martinez proved to be a formidable advocate. She called Mrs. Eleanor Watson to testify about the grassroots support for Hope's surgery, transforming the elderly woman into a powerful symbol of community compassion. Your Honor, Mrs. Watson said, her voice quavering but determined, I'm 78 years old, and I've seen a lot of suffering in my time. Lost my husband to cancer, my grandson to leukemia. There's enough sadness in this world without adding to it when we have the power to heal. The real breakthrough came when Martinez revealed Crawford's financial conflicts of interest. Through Tommy Chen's investigative work, she had uncovered that Crawford received consulting fees from hunting outfitters who benefited from lower bear populations. More damaging still, she presented evidence that Crawford had consistently denied funding for bear rehabilitation while approving expensive programs that favored hunting interests. Mr. Crawford speaks of fiscal responsibility, Martinez argued, but the record shows a pattern of bias against bear conservation that predates this case by years. This isn't about budget constraints, it's about personal vendetta masquerading as policy. The courtroom erupted when Martinez called her surprise witness, Dr. Margaret Crawford, the director's own wife. The elegant woman in her 50s took the stand with visible reluctance, but her testimony proved devastating to her husband's case. "James changed after David died," she said quietly, refusing to meet her husband's eyes. "The man who once taught our son to respect and love wildlife became someone who saw every bear as a threat. He's not making this decision based on science or budget concerns. He's making it out of grief and anger that he's never properly addressed." She revealed that she had secretly donated $5,000 to Hope's surgery fund under a false name. "I've watched my husband turn his pain into policy for 15 years. Maybe it's time for healing instead of more hurt." The emotional climax came when Sarah herself took the stand. Rebecca Martinez walked her through her qualifications, her years of experience, and her professional assessment of Hope's chances. But it was the cross-examination that revealed the heart of the matter. "Dr. Mitchell," David Kim pressed, "isn't it true that you see your deceased son Tommy in this bear cub?" Sarah was quiet for a long moment, feeling the weight of hundreds of eyes upon her. When she finally spoke, her voice was clear and strong. "Yes, I think about Tommy every day. I think about him when I see any young creature suffering. But that doesn't make my medical judgment invalid. It makes me more committed to preventing unnecessary loss. Hope reminds me that we have the power to choose healing over helplessness, hope over despair." "But isn't this really about your inability to accept your son's death?" "This is about my ability to honor his memory by saving a life I actually can save," Sarah replied, tears streaming down her face. "Tommy loved animals. He wanted to be a veterinarian like his mom. If he were here, he'd be the first person asking why we're debating whether to help a creature that's depending on us for survival." The courtroom fell silent, except for the sound of people openly weeping. Even some of Crawford's supporters seemed moved by Sarah's raw honesty. The final testimony came from Dr. Patricia Williams, who presented detailed surgical plans and post-operative care protocols. Her presentation was technical but passionate, outlining how modern veterinary techniques made Hope's surgery not only possible, but probable to succeed. "We're not talking about experimental procedures," Dr. Williams explained. "Tumor removal surgery has been performed successfully on bears in captivity multiple times. The difference here is that we're applying proven techniques to save a wild animal rather than a zoo specimen. The precedent isn't dangerous, it's hopeful." Judge Thornfield called for a recess before making her decision, leaving both sides to wait in agonizing uncertainty. Outside the courthouse, the crowd had grown to over 300 people. Sarah was amazed to see familiar faces among the supporters. Mrs. Watson had brought a busload of seniors from her retirement community. Michael's extended family had driven down from Canada, and dozens of veterinary students from the University of Montana held a candlelight vigil. The opposition was equally vocal. A group calling itself Fiscal Responsibility First had organized a counter-protest, arguing that government resources should go to human needs rather than expensive animal surgeries. Their leader, a local businessman named Roger Caldwell, gave impromptu interviews explaining how the money could fund school programs or veteran services instead. The tension reached a breaking point when the two groups began shouting at each other across the courthouse steps. "How can you value an animal over human children?" Caldwell demanded of Mrs. Watson. The elderly woman stood her ground with surprising firmness. "Young man, compassion isn't a zero-sum game. Teaching our children that all life has value doesn't take anything away from human welfare. It adds to it." As evening approached, word spread that Judge Thornfield would announce her decision at 9 o'clock. Sarah spent the waiting hours at the center with Hope, who had remained stable despite the stress of being at the center of a national controversy. The bear cub seemed unaware of the battle being fought over her life, focusing instead on the simple comfort of Sarah's presence. "Whatever happens tomorrow, I want you to know I tried," Sarah whispered to Hope as the sun set over the Montana mountains. "You deserve every chance at life, just like every other living creature." Outside, the vigil continued through the night, hundreds of people holding candles and sharing stories of their own losses and hopes. The battle for hope had become something larger than a single bear's fate. It had become a referendum on what kind of society America wanted to be, and whether compassion could still triumph over cynicism in an increasingly divided world. The courtroom was packed beyond capacity when Judge Thornfield returned at 9 o'clock sharp. Her expression revealed nothing as she settled into her chair and surveyed the crowd that had waited hours for her decision. Sarah gripped Michael's hand so tightly she could feel his bones, while Crawford sat rigid in his chair, his wife conspicuously absent from his side. After careful consideration of all testimony and evidence presented, Judge Thornfield began, her voice carrying clearly through the silent courtroom. This court finds that the plaintiff has failed to demonstrate that Dr. Mitchell's proposed treatment plan violates federal guidelines or represents an abuse of government resources. The temporary restraining order is hereby dissolved, and Dr. Mitchell is authorized to proceed with surgical intervention. The explosion of cheers and applause drowned out the rest of the judge's remarks. Sarah collapsed into Rebecca Martinez's arms, sobbing with relief and exhaustion. Crawford's face went ashen as his legal team immediately began discussing appeal options, but Sarah barely noticed. They had won the legal battle, but the real fight was just beginning. Surgery was scheduled for the following Monday, exactly 1 week away. Dr. Patricia Williams assembled a surgical team that read like a who's who of veterinary medicine. Dr. James Morrison, a neurosurgeon from UC Davis who specialized in tumor removal. Dr. Lisa Chen, an anesthesiologist from Cornell who had worked on everything from elephants to eagles. And Dr. Robert Martinez, a reconstructive specialist from Texas A&M who had pioneered facial surgery techniques for injured wildlife. The media circus intensified as the surgery date approached. CNN set up a permanent camera position outside the rehabilitation center. Good Morning America flew Sarah to New York for a live interview that was watched by 12 million people. The GoFundMe campaign had swelled to over $400,000, with donations still pouring in from around the world. But not all the attention was positive. The death threats intensified, forcing the sheriff's department to assign security to both Sarah and the facility. Someone spray-painted "Animal Killer" on Crawford's car, while Sarah's home was vandalized with "Taxpayer Thief" scrawled across her garage door. The polarization had reached a toxic level that frightened even seasoned activists. Hope, meanwhile, remained blissfully unaware of the chaos surrounding her. Her condition had stabilized somewhat, though the tumor continued its relentless growth. Sarah spent every spare moment with the bear cub, talking to her in the same gentle voice she had once used with Tommy during his bedtime stories. "You know, sweetheart," Sarah whispered during one of their quiet moments together, "half the country is praying for you, and the other half thinks I'm crazy for trying to save you. But I've learned something these past weeks. Sometimes the craziest thing you can do is care too much, and sometimes that's exactly what the world needs." The night before surgery, Sarah received an unexpected visitor. Crawford appeared at the center just after midnight, looking haggard and defeated. His usual crisp appearance was replaced by wrinkled clothes and 3 days of stubble. "I wanted to see her," he said quietly, avoiding Sarah's eyes. "Before tomorrow." Sarah led him to Hope's enclosure, where the bear cub was sleeping peacefully under a heat lamp. Crawford stood silently for several minutes, his hands gripping the bars with white knuckles. "She looks so much like the cubs David used to draw," he finally said, his voice barely audible. He was always sketching bears in his notebooks, making up stories about bear families living in caves and raising their young. He never saw them as dangerous, just as another kind of family trying to survive. Sarah watched Crawford's face transform as years of suppressed grief finally surfaced. "After he died, I couldn't look at a bear without seeing the one that killed him. Every conservation program felt like a betrayal of his memory. But looking at her now, she's just a baby who needs help," Sarah finished gently. Crawford nodded, tears streaming down his face. "I've spent 15 years trying to honor David's memory by preventing other families from experiencing what we went through. But maybe the better way to honor him would be to remember the boy who loved all living things, not the man who learned to fear them." The conversation continued for over an hour, with Crawford sharing memories of his son that he hadn't spoken aloud in years. David had wanted to be a park ranger, just like Michael Thompson. He had collected stuffed animals and nature books, dreaming of a world where humans and wildlife coexisted peacefully. "I'm not asking for forgiveness," Crawford said as he prepared to leave. "But I want you to know that I won't stand in your way anymore. Save her if you can, Sarah. Save her for all the Davids and Tommies who believe the world should be a place where love wins over fear." Surgery day dawned gray and drizzly, with protesters on both sides maintaining their vigils despite the weather. The surgical team had arrived the night before, transforming the center's main operating room into a state-of-the-art facility that would have impressed any human hospital. At 7 in the morning, Hope was sedated and prepped for the 8-hour procedure that would determine her fate. Sarah suited up as the primary surgeon, with Dr. Morrison leading the neurosurgical components and Dr. Martinez handling the reconstructive work. Dr. Chen monitored Hope's vital signs with the precision of someone who understood that the world was watching. The tumor proved even more extensive than the imaging had suggested. What appeared to be a single growth was actually a complex network of interconnected masses that had wrapped around critical facial nerves and pressed against Hope's brain stem. The surgical team worked with painstaking precision, removing tissue millimeter by millimeter while constantly monitoring Hope's neurological responses. 3 hours into the surgery, Hope's heart rate began to fluctuate dangerously. Dr. Chen's calm voice cut through the tension. "We're losing her," heart rate dropping to 45 and falling. Sarah's hands never stopped moving as the team fought to stabilize their patient. This was the moment she had dreaded, the possibility that their attempt to save Hope might actually kill her. The parallels to Tommy's final moments in the emergency room were almost overwhelming, but Sarah forced herself to focus on the present, on the life she could still save. "Come on, sweetheart," she whispered as she worked. "Don't give up on us now. Too many people are counting on you." The critical moment lasted 27 minutes. 27 minutes during which Hope's life hung in the balance while her surgical team fought to keep her alive. Outside, the crowd had grown to over 1,000 people, all maintaining a vigil that felt more like a prayer than a protest. When Hope's heart rate finally stabilized, a cheer went up from the surgical team that could be heard throughout the facility. But the hardest part was still ahead. The tumor removal had gone better than expected, but the reconstructive work would determine whether Hope could ever return to the wild. Dr. Martinez performed what he later called the most technically challenging facial reconstruction of my career, rebuilding Hope's left eye socket and realigning her jaw using a combination of bone grafts and surgical mesh. The goal wasn't cosmetic perfection, but functional restoration. Hope needed to be able to see, eat, and survive in her natural habitat. As the 8th hour approached, the final sutures were placed and Hope was wheeled into recovery. The surgical team was exhausted but cautiously optimistic. They had removed 95% of the tumor mass while preserving all critical facial functions. Hope's left eye, which had been completely sealed shut, was now partially open. Her jaw alignment had been corrected to allow normal eating. But the real test would come when Hope woke up. Would she be the same bear who had learned to trust humans? Or would the trauma of surgery have changed her fundamental nature? Would the physical healing translate into a genuine chance at returning to the wild? Sarah remained by Hope's side as the anesthesia wore off, watching for the first signs of consciousness. When Hope's eyes finally fluttered open, both eyes for the first time in months, Sarah felt a surge of hope that reminded her why she had become a veterinarian in the first place. "Welcome back, beautiful girl," Sarah whispered, gently stroking Hope's fur. "You did it. You're going to be okay." Outside, the crowd erupted in celebration as news of the successful surgery spread, but Sarah knew that the surgery was only the beginning. The real challenge would be helping Hope recover not just physically, but emotionally, preparing her for an eventual return to the wild while healing the psychological wounds that had brought them all together in this extraordinary moment of shared hope. The euphoria of surgical success lasted exactly 72 hours. Then Hope stopped eating. It began subtly. A piece of salmon left untouched here, a honey-soaked apple ignored there. Sarah initially attributed it to post-surgical discomfort, but by the fourth day, Hope had refused all food entirely. Her weight began dropping at an alarming rate, and the bright alertness that had followed her awakening from surgery faded into a vacant, distant stare. "She's giving up," Dr. Patricia Williams observed during the morning rounds, her voice heavy with concern. "Physically, everything looks perfect. The incision sites are healing beautifully, there's no sign of infection, and her neurological responses are normal. But psychologically—" Sarah knelt beside Hope's enclosure, watching the bear cub lying motionless in the corner, her face turned toward the wall. The surgical bandages had been removed, revealing the remarkable success of Dr. Martinez's reconstructive work. Hope's left eye was fully functional, her jaw properly aligned, and the grotesque tumor completely gone. She looked like a normal, healthy bear cub, except for the profound sadness that seemed to emanate from her entire being. "What did we do to you?" Sarah whispered, reaching through the bars to stroke Hope's fur. The bear didn't respond, didn't even acknowledge the touch that had once brought her comfort. The media, which had celebrated the surgical triumph with headlines like "Miracle Surgery Saves Hope" and "Bear Cub Beats the Odds," now began asking harder questions. Dr. Robert Harrison, the veterinary ethics expert who had testified against the surgery, appeared on multiple news programs with a grim vindication in his voice. "This is exactly what I warned about," Harrison told CNN's Anderson Cooper. "We subjected this animal to massive trauma for our own emotional satisfaction, and now she's suffering the psychological consequences. Sometimes the kindest thing we can do is accept natural limits rather than impose our will through medical intervention." The criticism stung because it echoed Sarah's own growing fears. She had fought so hard to save Hope's life, but had she saved it only to condemn the bear to a different kind of suffering? The parallel to her own experience with Tommy became increasingly painful. She had been helpless to save her son, but had her determination to save Hope actually made things worse? Crawford, surprisingly, became one of the few voices defending the surgical decision. His transformation since their midnight conversation had been remarkable to witness. During a press conference, he stood beside Sarah with an authority that surprised everyone. "Dr. Mitchell made a difficult decision based on the best available medical evidence," he stated firmly. "The psychological distress we're observing is a known complication of any major surgery, whether in humans or animals. Writing off Hope's recovery at this stage would be premature and contrary to everything we know about trauma rehabilitation." But even Crawford's support couldn't mask the growing sense of crisis. Hope's refusal to eat was becoming life-threatening. After a week without solid food, she was surviving only on glucose drips and forced hydration. Her body weight had dropped from 38 pounds to 31 pounds, a dangerous decline for an animal her size. The breaking point came when Hope began exhibiting behaviors that broke Sarah's heart. The bear cub would spend hours pressing her face against the corner of her enclosure, making soft, whimpering sounds that reminded Sarah painfully of the grief sounds she had made in the months after Tommy's death. When Sarah approached, Hope would close her eyes and turn away, as if rejecting the very presence of the humans who had saved her life. "She doesn't trust us anymore," Lisa Thompson observed, watching Hope's latest feeding attempt result in the same listless rejection. "The surgery traumatized her so badly that she's lost her connection to humans. Without that trust, we can't help her recover." Dr. Williams suggested consulting with animal behaviorists and trauma specialists, but their recommendations, environmental enrichment, pharmaceutical intervention, isolation therapy, all failed to penetrate Hope's emotional shutdown. The bear seemed determined to waste away, choosing a slow death over engagement with the world that had hurt her. The public response was swift and brutal. Social media, which had rallied around #SaveHope during the legal battle, now turned critical. #Let Hope Go began trending, with thousands of comments arguing that the surgery had been a mistake driven by human arrogance rather than animal welfare. "We forced her to live for our own emotional needs," wrote one typical comment that received 10,000 likes. "Look at her now. She's suffering more than if we had just let her go peacefully in the beginning." Sarah found herself reading these comments obsessively, each one confirming her worst fears about her own motivations. Had she really been trying to save Hope? Or had she been trying to save herself from another devastating loss? The distinction became increasingly unclear as Hope's condition deteriorated. The crisis deepened when several major donors began demanding refunds from the GoFundMe campaign. A group of veterinary students at UC Davis published an open letter questioning the ethics of the entire endeavor. Even Mrs. Eleanor Watson, Hope's most devoted supporter, called Sarah with tears in her voice. "Honey, I'm not giving up on that little one," the elderly woman said, "but I'm scared we might be loving her to death." Sometimes love means knowing when to let go. That night, Sarah sat alone in her office, staring at the framed photograph of Tommy that she kept on her desk. In the picture, he was grinning gap-toothed at the camera while holding a stuffed bear, an irony that wasn't lost on her now. She had thought saving Hope would help her heal from Tommy's loss, but instead, it seemed to be reopening wounds she thought had begun to close. The lowest point came when Sarah found herself seriously considering Crawford's original recommendation for euthanasia. Hope had been refusing food for 10 days, and her condition was becoming critical. The bear, who had once shown such spirit and resilience, now seemed to be actively choosing death over recovery. Sarah spent that night in Hope's room, sitting on the floor beside the enclosure and talking to the bear as she had during their early days together. But this time, instead of hope and encouragement, her words carried the weight of defeat and apology. "I'm so sorry, sweetheart," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. "I thought I was saving you, but maybe I was just being selfish. Maybe I needed to save you more than you needed to be saved." Hope lay motionless in the corner, her breathing shallow and labored. The beautiful reconstruction work that had seemed like such a triumph now felt like a cruel mockery. They had given Hope back her physical wholeness only to destroy her spirit in the process. It was Michael Thompson who finally voiced what everyone was thinking. During the next morning's staff meeting, the ranger who had found Hope looked directly at Sarah with the painful honesty that only true friendship allows. "Sarah, I think we need to start talking about end-of-life options," he said quietly. Hope is suffering, and we're prolonging that suffering because we can't accept that we might have been wrong. Sometimes the bravest thing we can do is admit our mistakes and choose compassion over pride. The words hit Sarah like a physical blow, but she knew he was right. The surgery had been a technical success, but an emotional catastrophe. They had saved Hope's life only to steal her will to live, and continuing to force her existence seemed increasingly cruel. That afternoon, Sarah called Dr. Harrison to discuss humane euthanasia procedures. The conversation was one of the most difficult of her professional life, but she knew that her responsibility to Hope meant accepting the possibility that their miraculous rescue had ultimately been a tragic mistake. As she hung up the phone, Sarah looked out the window at the Montana wilderness where Hope should have been living freely. Instead, the bear cub lay dying in a sterile cage, broken by the very kindness that had been meant to save her. The irony was almost too bitter to bear, and Sarah wondered if she had learned the hardest lesson of all, that sometimes love means knowing when to stop fighting, even when giving up feels like the greatest failure imaginable. The decision to end Hope's suffering was scheduled for the following morning, marking what felt like the devastating conclusion to a story that had begun with such promise and hope. The call came at 5:47 a.m., jarring Sarah from a restless sleep filled with dreams of Tommy and Hope playing together in some impossible meadow where grief couldn't reach them. Crawford's voice on the phone was urgent but strangely gentle, a tone she had never heard from him before. "Sarah, you need to get to the center immediately. Don't ask questions. Just come, and bring your camera." Sarah drove through the pre-dawn darkness with her heart pounding, certain that Hope had died during the night. The guilt was overwhelming. They had scheduled euthanasia for this morning, but perhaps Hope's body had made the decision for them. As she pulled into the parking lot, she was surprised to see Crawford's truck already there, along with several other vehicles she didn't recognize. Inside the facility, she found an impossible scene. Crawford stood beside Hope's enclosure, but he wasn't alone. Next to him was Dr. Maria Santos, the director of the Yellowstone Wildlife Sanctuary, along with a transport crate that was clearly occupied. The soft grunting sounds coming from inside made Sarah's breath catch. "James, what's going on?" Sarah demanded, using his first name for the first time in their professional relationship. Crawford's eyes were red-rimmed, suggesting he hadn't slept either. "I've been thinking about what you said, about David loving bears, about honoring his memory differently. So I made some calls." Dr. Santos stepped forward, her weathered face kind but serious. "Dr. Mitchell, we have a 10-year-old male black bear at our sanctuary who lost his mate and cubs to poachers last month. He's been exhibiting the same depressive symptoms as Hope, refusing food, withdrawing from contact, essentially giving up on life." Sarah stared at them both, not understanding. "I don't see how that helps Hope. If anything, it proves that what we're seeing is normal grief that time might heal if we just—" "Sarah, look," Crawford interrupted, pointing toward Hope's enclosure. For the first time since arriving, Sarah really looked at Hope. The bear cub was sitting upright, her ears alert and focused on the transport crate. As Sarah watched, Hope moved closer to the bars of her enclosure, making soft, chuffing sounds that Sarah hadn't heard since before the surgery. "Bears are social animals," Dr. Santos explained quietly. "In the wild, orphaned cubs are sometimes adopted by other bears who have lost their own young. We thought perhaps Hope's depression wasn't just about the surgical trauma, it was about being completely alone and isolated from her own kind." Crawford's voice was thick with emotion as he continued the explanation. "Yesterday, after our staff meeting, I couldn't stop thinking about David's favorite book. It was about a bear cub who gets lost and finds a new family. I used to read it to him every night, so I called Maria and asked if she had any bears who might benefit from companionship. Dr. Santos opened the transport crate, and out stepped the largest black bear Sarah had ever seen up close. Bruno, as he was called, was magnificent despite his own obvious signs of depression: patchy fur from stress-related grooming, visible weight loss, and the same hollow look in his eyes that Hope had been carrying. What happened next defied every expectation Sarah had about animal behavior. Hope pressed herself against the bars of her enclosure, making soft vocalizations that sounded almost like purring. Bruno approached slowly, sniffing the air and responding with his own gentle sounds. When the two bears were separated only by the metal bars between them, they touched noses through the barrier. "My God," Sarah whispered, tears streaming down her face. "She's responding." The transformation was immediate and dramatic. Hope, who had been listless and unresponsive for weeks, suddenly showed signs of her old curiosity and energy. She began exploring her enclosure as if seeing it for the first time. When Dr. Santos offered her a piece of salmon, Hope actually accepted it, the first solid food she had eaten in 11 days. Crawford was openly weeping now, his professional composure completely abandoned. "David always said that nobody should have to be alone when they're hurting. I've been so focused on my own pain that I forgot the simplest truth. Healing happens in relationship, not in isolation." The revelation that followed was even more stunning. Dr. Santos explained that Crawford had not only arranged for Bruno's visit, but had personally offered to fund a new rehabilitation facility specifically designed for orphaned and traumatized bears. The man who had fought so hard to prevent Hope's surgery was now proposing to create a sanctuary where bears like Hope could recover in the company of their own kind. "The original facility in Yellowstone can house up to 6 bears," Dr. Santos explained. "James has offered to fund a sister facility here in Montana specifically focused on rehabilitation and eventual release. Hope wouldn't be alone anymore. She'd be part of a community of bears learning to heal together." Sarah looked at Crawford with new understanding. "This is about David, isn't it? About the man he would have become." Crawford nodded, his voice barely audible. "My son wanted to work with animals, to help them heal and return to the wild. I've spent 15 years dishonoring that dream because I was too afraid and angry to remember who he really was. Maybe it's time I started living up to the father he deserved instead of the bitter man I became." The logistics of the new arrangement required careful planning. A Hope would need to be gradually introduced to Bruno in a controlled environment, with both bears monitored constantly for signs of stress or incompatibility. The goal was eventual release for both animals, but only if they could demonstrate the survival skills necessary for life in the wild. Over the next several hours, Sarah watched in amazement as Hope continued to show signs of improvement. The bear, who had been refusing all human contact, began cautiously approaching the front of her enclosure when Sarah offered food. More importantly, she was eating consistently for the first time since the surgery, apparently motivated by Bruno's presence and example. The media response to Crawford's transformation was swift and emotional. The same networks that had vilified him just days earlier now celebrated his change of heart as a powerful example of redemption and healing. The story of the grieving father who learned to honor his son's memory through compassion rather than vengeance resonated with audiences worldwide. But the most powerful revelation came when Crawford shared the full story of his son's death for the first time. David hadn't been killed by an aggressive bear, as most people assumed. He had wandered away from their campsite at Yellowstone and fallen into a ravine while trying to take photos of bear cubs playing in the distance. The mother bear who found him had actually tried to help, bringing other bears to the scene and making distress calls that eventually led rescuers to David's location. "The bear didn't kill my son," Crawford admitted during an emotional interview with CNN. David died from his injuries in the fall, but that mother bear stayed with him for hours until help arrived. She was trying to save him just like we've been trying to save Hope. I spent 15 years hating bears for something they didn't do when I should have been honoring their natural compassion. The revelation recontextualized everything about Crawford's opposition to Hope's surgery. His resistance hadn't been based on budget concerns or policy disagreements. It had been rooted in a fundamental misunderstanding of the very tragedy that had shaped his life. Mrs. Eleanor Watson, who had become something of a celebrity through her support of Hope, captured the public sentiment perfectly during her appearance on Good Morning America. "Sometimes the Lord works in mysterious ways, honey. He brought together a grieving mother, a bitter father, and a hurt little bear, and somehow they all found healing by helping each other. That's not medical science. That's pure grace." The most touching moment came when Crawford's wife, Margaret, returned to the rehabilitation center for the first time since testifying against her husband in court. She found him sitting quietly beside the enclosures where Hope and Bruno were learning to coexist, both bears showing signs of renewed vitality and purpose. "I thought I'd lost you forever to that anger," she told him, taking his hand for the first time in months. "I think I lost myself too," Crawford replied. "But watching Hope heal, watching her come back to life when she found Bruno, it reminded me that David always believed broken things could be fixed if you just loved them enough. Maybe it's time I started believing that again." As the sun set over the Montana mountains, Sarah stood watching Hope and Bruno share their evening meal, two rescued souls finding comfort in each other's presence. The surgical scars on Hope's face were barely visible now, and her eyes held the bright alertness of a bear ready to reclaim her place in the wild. For the first time since Tommy's death, Sarah felt something she had almost forgotten: the possibility of hope without the shadow of impending loss. Saving Hope had required more than surgical skill. It had demanded a community willing to transform pain into purpose, grief into grace, and isolation into connection. The real miracle, Sarah realized, wasn't the successful surgery or even Hope's physical recovery. It was the way one small bear's struggle had revealed the healing power of choosing love over fear again and again, until broken hearts learned to beat with renewed purpose. 6 months later, Sarah stood at the edge of the newly constructed release site in Glacier National Park, watching Hope take her first tentative steps into true freedom. The bear who had once been dying from a massive facial tumor was now a healthy, confident young adult, her surgical scars barely visible beneath her thick winter coat. Beside her, Bruno moved with the protective grace of an adoptive father, his own depression completely healed through their unlikely partnership. The release ceremony had drawn hundreds of supporters, but also skeptics who questioned whether Hope could truly survive in the wild after so much human intervention. Dr. Robert Harrison, the veterinary ethics expert who had opposed the surgery, stood among the observers with a grudging respect that had developed over months of witnessing Hope's remarkable recovery. "I was wrong," he admitted to Sarah as they watched Hope investigate a fallen log with typical bear curiosity. "I focused so much on the risks of intervention that I missed the possibility of genuine healing. She's not just physically recovered, she's thriving in ways I didn't think possible." The transformation hadn't been easy or quick. Hope and Bruno had spent 4 months in the semi-wild rehabilitation facility that Crawford's foundation had built, learning to forage, hunt, and navigate social hierarchies with other rescued bears. Hope had proven to be an exceptional student, her natural intelligence enhanced rather than diminished by her early experiences with humans. Crawford stood beside his wife Margaret, both of them wearing matching T-shirts that read David's Dream Wildlife Foundation, the organization that had grown from their son's love of animals into a nationally recognized force for wildlife rehabilitation. The bitter, defensive man who had once sought Hope's death was now her most dedicated protector. "You know what David would say if he could see this?" Crawford said to Sarah, his eyes bright with unshed tears. "He'd say we finally figured out that love is supposed to make things grow, not hold them back." The GPS collar around Hope's neck would allow researchers to track her movements for the next 2 years, providing crucial data about post-surgical bears' ability to survive in the wild. But Sarah had no doubt about the outcome. Hope moved through the forest with the confidence of a bear who knew exactly where she belonged. Mrs. Eleanor Watson, now 80 years old but still sharp as a tack, had insisted on attending despite the difficult mountain terrain. Supported by her great-grandson Tommy, named for Sarah's lost son, the elderly woman beamed as she watched Hope disappear into the tree line. "That little girl is living proof that miracles still happen," Mrs. Watson declared, her voice carrying across the assembled crowd. "Not the flashy kind you see in movies, but the quiet kind that happen when ordinary people decide to do extraordinary things for love." The media coverage of Hope's release focused on the medical success story, but Sarah understood that the real miracle was more complex. The bear's physical healing had been remarkable, but it was the emotional and spiritual healing of the humans involved that truly testified to the power of compassion over cynicism. Michael Thompson, who had found Hope dying by the creek 18 months earlier, now served as head ranger for the expanded wildlife rehabilitation program. His quiet strength had anchored the entire team through the crisis periods, and his wife Lisa had become Crawford's right-hand administrator for the foundation. "Sometimes I think Hope was sent to save us more than we were meant to save her," Michael observed as they watched the bears settle into their new territory. "Look at what she brought together, a grieving mother who learned to hope again, a bitter father who found his way back to love, a whole community that remembered what it means to fight for something that matters." Tommy Chen, the investigative journalist whose reporting had exposed Crawford's initial bias, had won a Pulitzer Prize for his series on Hope's story. But more importantly, his work had led to congressional hearings on wildlife funding that resulted in increased support for rehabilitation programs nationwide. Hope's story became a catalyst for examining how we as a society value wildlife conservation, Chen explained in his acceptance speech. Her surgery cost $85,000, but the legislation it inspired has funded rehabilitation efforts that have saved hundreds of animals and thousands of acres of habitat. The scientific implications of Hope's recovery extended far beyond a single bear's survival. Dr. Patricia Williams had published groundbreaking research on post-surgical trauma in wildlife, establishing protocols that were now being used in rehabilitation centers across North America. The surgical techniques developed for Hope's case had been successfully applied to 12 other bears with similar conditions. But it was the personal transformations that moved Sarah most deeply. Crawford's marriage had not only survived his radical change of heart, but had grown stronger as he and Margaret worked together to build David's legacy. They had adopted 2 children from the foster system, siblings who had lost their parents in a car accident, creating a family born from loss, but sustained by love. Sarah herself had undergone the most profound change of all. The desperate grief that had driven her to fight for Hope's life had gradually transformed into a sustainable sense of purpose. She had established the Tommy Mitchell Center for Wildlife Medicine, a training facility that taught young veterinarians to combine technical excellence with emotional resilience. "I used to think saving Hope would somehow bring Tommy back," Sarah reflected during her keynote address at the American Veterinary Medical Association conference. "What I learned instead is that grief doesn't end when we find new purpose. It transforms into something that can heal rather than destroy." The center now housed 6 full-time staff and 12 rotating veterinary students, all learning to navigate the complex intersection of medical science and animal welfare. Sarah's approach emphasized what she called holistic healing, treating not just the physical injury but the emotional trauma that often accompanied wildlife rescue situations. Hope's release had been carefully timed to coincide with her natural breeding season, and the tracking data soon revealed what everyone had hoped for. She was successfully integrating with wild bear populations. Within 3 months, the GPS collar showed movement patterns indicating she had found a mate and was establishing territory in the deep wilderness areas of the park. Bruno, meanwhile, had chosen a different path. Now, fully recovered from his own depression, he had become something of a mentor to newly rescued bears at the rehabilitation facility. His gentle nature and healing presence made him invaluable for helping traumatized cubs learn to trust again. The first anniversary of Hope's release brought unexpected news that sent ripples of joy through the entire support network. The tracking data revealed that Hope had given birth to twin cubs, both healthy and thriving under their mother's expert care. The bear, who had once been dying alone, was now raising the next generation in the wild where she belonged. Sarah stood in the same spot where they had released Hope a year earlier, reading the data from the latest tracking report to a small gathering of the core team who had made the miracle possible. The cubs showed no signs of the genetic abnormalities that had caused Hope's tumor, suggesting that her own healing had been complete and permanent. "Two healthy cubs," Sarah announced, her voice thick with emotion. "Hope is not just surviving, she's creating new life, passing on everything she learned about resilience and second chances." Crawford wiped tears from his eyes openly, no longer concerned about maintaining professional composure. "David always said that the best stories don't end. They just turn into new beginnings. I think Hope is proving him right." As the sun set behind the Montana peaks, the group shared a moment of profound gratitude for the journey that had brought them all together. Hope's story had become a testament to the power of refusing to accept defeat, of choosing love over fear, and of believing that broken things could indeed be healed when people committed to doing the hard work of caring. The tracking beacon would continue transmitting for another year, but Sarah knew they had already received the most important data possible. Hope had not just survived her ordeal, but had transformed it into the foundation for new life and continued hope. In her final journal entry about the case, Sarah wrote, "We saved Hope's life, but in the end, she saved ours." She taught us that healing isn't about forgetting pain. It's about transforming pain into purpose, isolation into connection, and despair into the radical act of loving again despite every reason not to. The bear they had named Hope had indeed become exactly what her name promised, a living symbol that even in our darkest moments, love could still triumph, healing was still possible, and tomorrow could still hold miracles for those brave enough to fight for them. Years later, when people asked Sarah about the most important case of her career, she would smile and tell them about a dying bear cub who taught an entire community that sometimes the most powerful medicine isn't found in surgical suites or pharmaceutical laboratories. It's found in the simple revolutionary act of refusing to give up on love. Friends, as we reach the golden years of our lives, many of us carry wounds that feel too deep to heal. The loss of loved ones, dreams deferred, relationships broken by time and circumstance. Hope's story reminds us that it's never too late for transformation, never too late to choose love over bitterness. Just like Crawford, who spent 15 years consumed by grief and anger before finding his way back to the father his son would have been proud of, we too can rewrite our endings. At 55, 60, or 68, we still have time to turn our pain into purpose, our isolation into connection. Mrs. Eleanor Watson at 78 proved that age is just a number when your heart is committed to making a difference. Sarah discovered that saving others became the path to saving herself. Sometimes our greatest heartbreaks become the foundation for our most meaningful contributions. The scars don't disappear, but they can become beautiful reminders of our resilience. Your story isn't over. Perhaps your most important chapter is just beginning. Every day you wake up is another chance to transform grief into grace, to choose hope over despair. What loss in your life could become a source of healing for others? Have you ever experienced unexpected redemption when you thought all hope was gone? Share your story. Your words might be exactly what someone else needs to hear today.